What if the most dangerous weapon in American history wasn't a bomb, a bullet, or a warhead? It was a document, a 47-volume classified history that proved a war was built on a lie. A 693-page internal confession the CIA hid for 25 years. 28 pages ripped from a congressional report because they named names no one in Washington wanted spoken aloud. These weren't classified because they were dangerous to you. They were classified because they were dangerous to the people classifying them. Today we are covering 13 American documents that were buried, shredded, redacted, and locked in vaults, not to protect national security, but to protect the people who broke it. Every single one is real. Every single one was eventually found. 1. In 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officers in the United States, sat in a room inside the Pentagon and drafted a plan to attack American citizens on American soil. The document was called Justification for United States Military Intervention in Cuba. It was signed by Chairman Lyman Lemnitzer and presented to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara on March 13, 1962. What was inside it was a menu of proposed false flag operations, sink boats full of Cuban refugees, real refugees, blow up an American ship in Guantanamo Bay, stage terrorist bombings in Miami and Washington, D.C., hijack civilian aircraft. All of it designed to look like Cuba did it. All of it intended to justify a full-scale American invasion. These were not hypotheticals scribbled on a napkin. This was a formal memo, typed on Department of Defense letterhead, with operational timelines and casualty projections. President Kennedy rejected it. Lemnitzer was quietly reassigned. The memo was classified and buried for 35 years. It was not declassified until 1997, when the Assassination Records Review Board pulled it from the National Archives. The threat was never Cuba. The threat was that the American public might discover its own military had proposed murdering them for a geopolitical chess move. That was the threat. 2. On October 7, 1940, 14 months before Pearl Harbor, a Navy intelligence officer named Lieutenant Commander Arthur McCollum wrote a 5-page memo to his superiors. It outlined an 8-point plan, 8 specific actions the United States could take to provoke the Empire of Japan into firing the first shot. Keep the Pacific Fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor as a sitting target. Impose a full trade embargo on Japan. Aid Chiang Kai-shek's resistance. Send heavy cruisers to the Philippines and Singapore. Station submarines in the east. Refuse all Japanese diplomatic compromises. The memo concluded that if the United States followed all 8 steps, Japan would be forced into an act of war. It was a blueprint for provocation, and it was written more than a year before December 7, 1941. The government has never confirmed whether Franklin Delano Roosevelt read it. Historians have fought over it for decades. What is not in dispute is that the memo existed, that every single one of its 8 recommendations was eventually carried out, and that it was classified for over 50 years. They didn't classify it because it was speculative. They classified it because it was accurate. That was the threat. 3. In 1956, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover launched a secret program called COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program. Its stated mission was to disrupt domestic political organizations. Its actual mission was to destroy them. Over the next 15 years, the FBI infiltrated, surveilled, discredited, and sabotaged American citizens exercising their constitutional rights. Civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, feminist organizations, black nationalist groups, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the American Indian Movement. But the single most damning document in the COINTELPRO files was a letter. In November 1964, the FBI mailed an anonymous letter to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It included surveillance recordings from hotel rooms and a single, unmistakable message: "Kill yourself within 34 days or we will release this to the press." The letter was composed by William Sullivan, the FBI head of domestic intelligence, and approved by J. Edgar Hoover himself. A federal law enforcement agency used taxpayer resources to send a suicide threat to a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. They did not classify COINTELPRO because it was protecting national security. They classified it because the FBI was the national security threat. And the only reason you know about any of this is because in 1971, a group of 8 civilians broke into an FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania, stole over 1,000 documents, and mailed them to newspapers. That was not an intelligence failure. That was democracy doing the FBI's job for it. 4. On August 4, 1964, President Lyndon Johnson told the American public that North Vietnamese torpedo boats had launched an unprovoked attack on the USS Maddox in the Gulf of Tonkin. Within 72 hours, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. It gave the president authority to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. 58,220 Americans would eventually die in Vietnam, over 2 million Vietnamese. The cables told a different story. Classified NSA intercepts showed that the signal's intelligence had been misread. Officers on the Maddox reported they were firing at radar ghosts. Captain John Herrick sent a cable within hours of the supposed attack, urging a complete review before any response, stating that the entire incident may have been the result of freak weather conditions and an overeager sonar crew. Those cables were classified for over 40 years. The internal history of the NSA, declassified in 2005, confirmed what the cables said. The second attack never happened. They did not classify those cables because they contained sensitive military intelligence. They classified them because they proved the president lied to Congress, and Congress authorized a war based on an event that did not occur. That was the threat. You have heard of MK Ultra. You know the CIA dosed unwitting American citizens with LSD. You may even know the name Sidney Gottlieb, the chemist who ran the program from 1953 to 1973. What you probably do not know is how the budget documents worked, because that is where the real architecture of the cover-up lived. CIA Director Richard Helms ordered all MK Ultra files destroyed in 1973, and most of them were. But 20,000 pages survived, and they survived because they were financial records, misfiled in a different building. Those budget documents revealed that the CIA had funneled money through at least 44 universities, 12 hospitals, 3 prisons, and over 80 institutions. They used front organizations, the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, and the Geschichter Fund for Medical Research, to launder payments so that the researchers themselves often did not know the CIA was their client. At least one subject, Frank Olson, a CIA biochemist, died after being secretly dosed with LSD by his own colleagues. His death was ruled a suicide. His family did not learn the truth for 22 years. The budget documents were not classified because the experiments were sensitive. They were classified because they were a receipt. They proved what was spent, where it went, and who approved it. You can deny a program existed. You cannot deny a check that cleared. 6. Here is something worth sitting with. Every item you have heard so far, COINTELPRO, MK Ultra, domestic surveillance, and assassination plots, was investigated by the same committee. In 1975, Senator Frank Church of Idaho chaired a special Senate committee that spent 2 years investigating the intelligence community. The committee reviewed over 110,000 documents, conducted 800 interviews, and held 126 hearings. 21 of them were in public session. What they found was a government at war with its own citizens. CIA assassination plots against foreign leaders, including Fidel Castro, Patrice Lumumba, and Rafael Trujillo. FBI surveillance of American journalists, professors, and members of Congress. NSA interception of international telegrams sent by ordinary Americans. IRS audits weaponized against political dissidents. The Church Committee did not discover a single rogue agent. It discovered a system, multiple agencies, decades of operations, all exposed by one committee that had the subpoena power to open the vaults. The full classified annexes of the Church Committee report were not released for decades. Some remain classified today, 50 years later. They did not classify the findings because they would endanger active agents. They classified them because the findings indicted the agencies doing the classifying. And that may be the most honest thing a Senate committee has ever accidentally proved. 7. On October 4th, 2001, 23 days after September 11th, President George W. Bush signed a classified authorization that the American public would not learn about for 4 years. The program was codenamed Stellar Wind. It authorized the NSA to intercept the phone calls and emails of American citizens without a warrant, without judicial approval, and without any of the oversight mechanisms required by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. The legal justification was written by John Yoo and David Addington inside the Office of Legal Counsel. It argued that the president's wartime authority overrode the Fourth Amendment. When Deputy Attorney General James Comey and FBI Director Robert Mueller reviewed the program in 2004, they threatened to resign unless it was modified. The confrontation happened at the hospital bedside of Attorney General John Ashcroft, who was recovering from surgery. The authorization document itself, the original signed order, remained classified for years. The public only learned of the program because a New York Times reporter named James Risen broke the story in December 2005. The Times had held the story for over a year at the request of the White House. They didn't classify Stellar Wind because it was catching terrorists. They classified it because it was catching everyone. That was the threat. 8. This is where the items stop being about what the government hid and start being about what the government legalized. On August 1st, 2002, Deputy Assistant Attorney General John Yoo wrote a memo to White House counsel Alberto Gonzales. It was 50 pages long, and it redefined torture. The memo argued that interrogation techniques only constituted torture if they produced pain equivalent to organ failure or death. Anything below that threshold, such as waterboarding, stress positions, sleep deprivation for up to 11 consecutive days, or confinement in a box with insects, was, the memo said, legal. The CIA used this memo as its operating license. At least 119 detainees were subjected to the program. At least 39 were subjected to the enhanced techniques personally authorized by these memos. At least one detainee, Gul Rahman, froze to death in a CIA black site in Afghanistan in November 2002, chained to a concrete floor in a cell kept at 36 degrees. The memos were classified until 2009, when President Obama ordered their release over the objections of the CIA. They were not classified because releasing them would endanger interrogators. They were classified because releasing them would prove that the United States government had written its own permission slip to commit acts that the Geneva Conventions define as war crimes. The most dangerous thing about the torture memos was never what they authorized. It was that a lawyer in a windowless office could write a sentence, and that sentence could make cruelty legal. In 1986, the American public learned that senior officials in the Reagan administration had secretly sold weapons to Iran, a country under a United States arms embargo, and funneled the profits to fund Contra rebels in Nicaragua, which Congress had explicitly prohibited. 14 administration officials were charged, 11 were convicted. National Security Council staff member Oliver North was convicted of 3 felonies. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger was indicted on 5 counts of perjury and obstruction. Then, on December 24, 1992, Christmas Eve, 26 days before leaving office, President George H.W. Bush pardoned 6 of the convicted officials, including Weinberger, whose trial was scheduled to begin in 2 weeks. Independent counsel Lawrence Walsh called it the completion of a cover-up. Weinberger's diary, which was to be introduced at trial, reportedly contained entries implicating Bush himself in the arms for hostages decision, a fact Bush had denied under oath. The pardons documentation, the internal deliberations, the legal memos weighing who to pardon and why, and the communications between the White House and the defendant's attorneys remained shielded from public scrutiny. They did not classify those deliberations because they were routine exercises of executive power. They classified them because a president used the pardon power to prevent his own administration from being tried for crimes he may have participated in. That was the threat. 13 documents, every one of them written by the government, about the government, and then hidden by the government. Not from foreign enemies, from you. We are not done. 10. On July 23, 2002, 8 months before the invasion of Iraq, British intelligence chief Sir Richard Dearlove briefed Prime Minister Tony Blair and his senior national security team at 10 Downing Street. A classified summary of that meeting was written by Matthew Rycroft, a foreign policy aide. It was marked secret and strictly personal, UK eyes only. The memo contained one sentence that, when it leaked 3 years later, fractured the legal and moral justification for the Iraq War. Dearlove reported that in Washington, the intelligence and facts were being fixed around the policy. Fixed. Not gathered, not analyzed. Fixed. Around a policy of invasion that had already been decided. The memo was leaked to the Sunday Times in May 2005. The Bush administration never disputed its authenticity. The Blair government never denied the meeting took place. They did not classify the Downing Street memo because it revealed intelligence sources. They classified it because it proved, in the British government's own handwriting, that the case for a war that killed over 4,400 Americans and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis was built backward. Conclusion. First, evidence manufactured to fit. That was the threat. In 1971, a military analyst named Daniel Ellsberg walked out of the Rand Corporation with 7,000 pages of classified documents under his arm. He had spent 2 years secretly photocopying them, one page at a time, often with the help of his 13-year-old son. The documents were a 47-volume study commissioned by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara in 1967. Their official title was History of United States Decision-Making in Vietnam from 1945 to 1968. What they contained was a 23-year record of systematic deception. 4 consecutive administrations, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, had lied to Congress and the American public about the scope, the purpose, and the viability of the Vietnam War. The study showed that the government knew the war was unwinnable and escalated it anyway. It showed that casualty projections were suppressed and that bombing campaigns were expanded while officials publicly promised de-escalation. Ellsberg gave the papers to the New York Times. The Nixon administration obtained a federal injunction to stop publication. The first time in American history the government had imposed prior restraint on a newspaper. The case went to the Supreme Court. In New York Times Company versus United States, the court ruled 6-3 that the First Amendment protected the right to publish. Nixon's response was to create the White House Plumbers, a covert team tasked with discrediting Ellsberg. They broke into his psychiatrist's office looking for dirt. That same team later broke into the Watergate Hotel. The Pentagon Papers were not classified because they contained troop positions or nuclear codes. They were classified because they proved that the government of the United States had conducted a secret war against the truth for 2 decades, and 58,000 Americans had died inside the lie. Ellsberg faced 115 years in prison. The charges were dismissed when the court discovered the government had wiretapped him illegally and burglarized his doctor's office. The man who stole the documents went free. The men who tried to stop him ended a presidency. 12. In December 1974, New York Times reporter Seymour Hersh published a front-page story revealing that the CIA had conducted a massive illegal domestic surveillance operation against American anti-war activists and dissidents. What Hersh did not know at the time was that his story had triggered a panic inside Langley. The CIA already had a document that cataloged its own crimes. They had written it themselves. In 1973, see why. A director, James Schlesinger, ordered every division of the agency to compile a list of activities that might be outside the CIA's legal charter. The result was a 693-page internal confession known as the Family Jewels. The document detailed assassination plots against foreign leaders, illegal wiretapping of American journalists, including columnist Jack Anderson, surveillance of over 300,000 Americans through a mail opening program called HTL Linguel, drug testing on unwitting citizens, collaboration with the Mafia to kill Fidel Castro, 693 pages written by the CIA about the CIA, detailing crimes committed by the CIA, and then locked inside the CIA for 34 years. The Family Jewels were not declassified until June 2007, after a Freedom of Information Act request filed in 1992, 15 years earlier, finally forced their release. They did not classify the Family Jewels because the information was sensitive. They classified them because 693 pages of self-incrimination is not a file. It is a confession. Confessions are only classified when the person confessing is also the person holding the lock. 13. In December 2002, a joint congressional inquiry completed its investigation into the intelligence failures surrounding September 11, 2001. The final report was 838 pages long. It was released to the public with one section missing. 28 pages were ripped from the body of the report, classified at the direct order of President George W. Bush. They were locked in a secure reading room in the basement of the Capitol building, where members of Congress could read them only under supervision and were prohibited from taking notes. For 15 years, those 28 pages became the most infamous gap in the public record of the deadliest attack on American soil. Members of Congress who read them emerged shaken. Senator Bob Graham, who co-chaired the inquiry, spent over a decade publicly demanding their release. He said that the pages described a network of financial and logistical support for the hijackers that traced back to individuals connected to the Saudi Arabian government. 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi nationals. 2 of them, Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Mihdar, had received financial support and housing assistance from individuals with connections to the Saudi embassy and consulate while living openly in San Diego. The 28 pages were finally declassified in July 2016, 14 years after they were written. They confirmed what Graham had said. They described Saudi government employees and associates providing direct support to hijackers on American soil. No Saudi official was ever charged. The 9/11 Commission's final report, published in 2004, concluded there was no evidence that the Saudi government as an institution or senior Saudi officials individually funded al-Qaeda. The 28 pages that the public had not been allowed to read suggested otherwise. They did not classify those 28 pages because they would compromise an ongoing investigation. They classified them because 2,977 Americans died, and the pages named an ally. That was the threat. And that may be the most dangerous sentence in this entire video, not because it accuses anyone, but because it asks you to sit with the possibility that the classification system designed to protect you was used, in the shadow of the worst attack in American history, to protect a relationship. 13 documents, written by the government, hidden by the government. Not because they endangered the country, because they endangered the people running it. Governments do not classify documents because they are dangerous to you. They classify them because they are dangerous to the people doing the classifying. Which one had you never heard of before today? Drop it in the comments. We read every single one. If this changed the way you think about what gets classified and why, hit subscribe. We find the documents that were buried and bring them back into the light. The most dangerous thing the government ever wrote wasn't a weapon. It was a sentence someone was never supposed to read.